So I'd like to welcome you all to the International Symposium led by the UNESCO Chair in Democracy, Global Citizenship, and Transformative Education. Please note that this session is being recorded and that you can ask questions at any time through the chat feature. This session will be presented in English. For optimal viewing in Zoom, we recommend using speaker view. My name is Stephanie Johns, and I work at the Ontario SPCA and Humane Society in Ontario, Canada. My current role is Director of Marketing and Integrated Brand Development. I hold a bachelor and master's degree in environmental studies with a focus on humane education, and have the privilege of working alongside my colleagues on this panel today on work related to humane education and animal ethics on behalf of the Society. I am honored to chair this panel session today entitled, "We Are All Connected, One Welfare and Humane Education in Building Capacity and Fostering Empathy in Our Future Leaders." I hope you've had a chance to view the pre-recorded videos that accompany this session, and if not, they are available on the symposium website for future viewing. Now let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Magdalena Smrdelj is the Chief Veterinary Officer at the Ontario SPCA and Humane Society. As Chief Veterinary Officer, Dr. Smrdelj oversees shelter health and wellness programs and initiatives and veterinary medical services for the Society. With her team members, Dr. Smrdelj focuses on preventative care and high standards of care for all animals entering shelters that addresses both physical and emotional well-being while preparing them for their new home. She hopes to continue to support strong relationships and collaborative programs with partners in veterinary medicine, animal welfare, and other related industries. Dr. Smrdelj's professional interests are areas of focus, including One Welfare, veterinary preventative medicine, emerging and zoonotic diseases, and the human-animal bond. Amanda McKibbon is the Senior Director of Affiliate and Community Outreach at the Ontario SPCA. In this role, Amanda has the pleasure of engaging and collaborating with community and industry partners to improve not only the lives of animals, but also those of the people who love them and the communities in which they live. Amanda also leads a team responsible for humane education programming for youth and adults, including planning and executing the Change for Animals conference and the development, growth, and implementation of the Animal Smart Humane Education program. Amanda holds a BA in psychology and a master's in science in animal behavior and welfare, and has focused her career on animal well-being, research, and child psychological health. She is passionate about the power of connection, compassion, and education to shape a better future for all. Elizabeth Davis is the proud mother of two and a superintendent of schools in York Region District School Board, Ontario, Canada. She is passionate about school improvement work with a particular interest in resilience and working to improve outcomes for students in underperforming schools. She has worked to improve student achievement and well-being for over 15 years. Her recent interest in linking humane education and youth outreach has supported the development of innovative partnerships to support student success. Most recently, she is working to understand and apply integrative thinking tools in schools. Elizabeth has been a contributing author in two recent publications, Think You 1 to 3 Inquiry-Based Learning in the Primary Classroom, 2018, and The Principal Reader, Narratives of Experience, 2017. Alyse Patterson is currently a teacher in York Region District School Board. She is passionate about social justice, mental health, resilience, and student achievement, and has focused her attention on initiatives and partnerships for students who are underserved and underperforming. Alyse is working on her Master of Education, has a Bachelor of Arts and Science and a Bachelor of Education with special qualifications in special education. Alyse's area of research is inclusive education and anti-oppression. Along with her team, Alyse received the 2014 Premier's Award for Safe and Accepting Schools. Thank you all for being here today, and we'll now start our discussion. My first set of questions are for Dr. Smrdelj. Dr. Smrdelj, I understand you're making a connection between One Welfare, animal ethics, and humane education. So can you tell us a little bit more about the concept of One Welfare?
Thank you, Stephanie, and hello, everybody. Yes, so if we start with sort of older concepts like, well, that are still being used, but are more focused on just physical health, we can talk about One Health, that concept. And the One Health concept certainly brings together the idea of interconnections and interlinkages between human health, animal health, and environmental health. And so if we think of an example like antibiotic resistance, antimicrobial resistance, what we have is certain antibiotics that certain microbes become resistant to. And if those antibiotics end up in our environment, in our waterways, in our hospitals, they can certainly foster that antimicrobial resistance in those settings as well. And then we end up with disastrous effects where we're trying to use certain antibiotics. They're not effective, and we have very few others in our arsenal to combat some of these diseases. So that sort of is one example where all three areas are brought together. The One Welfare concept sort of takes it a little bit further, where you think about the well-being and welfare, including behavioral welfare and decreasing stress, so that, for instance, a herd of cattle may actually look quite healthy and they're free of physical diseases, but they're stressed from if there's an abundance of flies, and they're spending their time swatting their tails and feeling stressed by all the biting flies. That energy isn't going into the milk production. And so that's affecting production. And ultimately that affects the farmers, and it affects prices of these different products. And the flies are in the environment. It sort of just brings the whole thing together as well. So these are not brand new concepts, and certainly spiritual and philosophical concepts amongst many Indigenous cultures definitely think in terms of the one and the oneness and how everything is interconnected. So I think we're sort of playing catch up, really. But what it is it's a very holistic way of looking at things with very global implications.
Thank you, Magdalena. I think when you use the word holistic, it really sums up the concept. So do you have examples of anyone using the One Welfare concept in their work right now?
Yes, it's showing up in a lot of different places, even if it's not actually being called that. But for instance, there is a group out of the UK that came together and wrote a book called One Welfare. It's got a longer title than that. And but this One Welfare Handbook, it basically is sort of the beginnings, or sort of the springboard of trying to make all these connections clear. So for instance, if you think about the human-animal bond, right? So humans and animals, and then spending time in the environment, there's a lot of connections there around psychological health. A lot of research has shown that having animals in our lives, even if they're wild animals in your backyard, but animals in our lives definitely has some positive impact on us. And if you think of public health, emerging diseases like SARS-CoV-2, so a lot of these diseases are coming from the wildlife and then passing on to us. So there's a lot of groups that are working with this, researching and so forth. Another example is a couple of authors got together, two doctors, a medical doctor and a naturopathic doctor, collected a whole bunch of evidence and put that together in a book that's called Your Brain on Nature. And it's a wonderful book that just shows all kinds of studies that indicate that spending time in nature, spending time with animals, spending time by waterfalls or even a garden is very impactful for us, to the point where folks are talking about green prescriptions to help us connect with ourselves and feel calmer in the world, decrease our stress levels, that sort of thing. So going for a walk during lunch in a park, that kind of thing.
I think the concept of collaboration is really interesting. So when we're talking, as you mentioned in particular in the videos as well, about bringing together the animal side, the environmental side, and how that would, of course, bring together a variety of groups. Can you say a little bit more about that and perhaps share some examples?
Yeah, there are so many. One that comes to my mind from a very recent situation that many of you may have already heard about is, for instance, we're farming, we have large productions of cattle, and if they're in a very concentrated area, you're having a lot of manure being created, and that sort of is used in a nutrient management program where you make fertilizer and you want to spread that out over the lands. So there's many ways that that can affect our waterways if that ends up in the water from runoff, if the ground is still frozen or there's been too much laid out and we get a storm and it gets run off into the water. But right now in Florida, the manatees are starving, right? And so what's happening is the fertilizer is getting into the waterways. It's encouraging algal blooms. And these algal blooms are sort of a cover that are inhibiting the sunlight from getting into the water to the deeper levels where the seagrasses are. And the seagrasses is the prime dietary source for manatees. So they are suspecting that that is what's going on. And so, of course, a lot of different agencies, from wildlife agencies to environmental to agricultural, are involved in conversations like this, because it certainly impacts, our activities are impacting conservation. In our video, I also use the example of the harmful algal blooms getting right down into the ocean. And so then the sea lions are dying or getting neurological deficits from domoic acid, which is one of the metabolites from that, as well as certainly every year, I think we hear about pets, dogs especially, getting very sick and dying from going into a lake or a river that has harmful algal blooms in it. So now in the case of the manatees, it's not necessarily harmful algal blooms. It could just be algal blooms, but because they're creating kind of like a blanket over the surface of the water, the UV isn't getting through. And if we think of even today, this sort of huge experiment we've all been in with SARS-CoV-2 and the COVID-19, think of all the agencies that have been brought together, and governments and public health agencies, so many scientists, educational institutions, laboratories developing different tests, vaccinations. So there's been a lot of connection there. And then also, if I think of the investigation that was just going on a few months back, the WHO had a team of scientists and researchers going to China to see what they could find, to ask questions, look around. And so for many of you might not know, or you might know, but that China was dealing with massive die-offs of their swine herds from African swine fever. And African swine fever has been with them since August 2018. They have 50% of the worldwide population of pigs, and it's a huge protein source for them. And so you can imagine how devastating this is. And so a lot of farmers, their herds got decimated. And so the government was actually encouraging wildlife farming to help the farmers, to support them, to help them get out of poverty, and to provide protein sources. And so then the suspicion is that quite possibly the virus came from the bats to the wildlife and then to the people in the markets. And I don't think that we'll ever know 100%, but we certainly know that very closely related viruses have been found in bats and then in some of these other animals. And so the challenge there is that we'll never know, but we have some suspicions, and that should help us plan some prevention strategies. And certainly China banned wildlife farming back in February last year, I believe. So they acted very quickly when they saw that there could be a connection there. So again, a lot of agencies, a lot of collaboration, and I think hopefully, if we can get the politics off to the side a little bit, we'll see more of that so that we can really look at these things from a global perspective, because this was very different from the first SARS that we had last decade. Well, I guess it was 2002, where it only affected a few countries and we got it under control fairly quickly. And this one has gone global and we are still struggling with it more than a year, almost a year and a half later. Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, so it's easy to see that these issues aren't just local or in North America, but global. So let's talk about the future. How can we start to work the concept of one welfare into our future endeavors?
Yeah, so I think that I sort of touched on one aspect of it, which is I think that we really need to see more collaboration between all the different agencies, between veterinarians and scientists and medical professionals and government officials, and all the different levels that could have something to do with this, agricultural agencies, and that we can't be in silos. We really do need to have a sort of a oneness approach to this, that we are interconnected. We are traveling, not now maybe, but there's been global travel, global trade. And so we really are invited to start looking at this at a global level. And we're really invited to recognize that we are, our activities and our actions are impacting all three areas of this sort of one health, one welfare, one earth concept of human, animal, and environmental health. We're affecting the environment in terms of fertilizer, pollution, climate change, affecting the diversity of the wildlife. We're affecting human health and animal health in all these different ways that we talked about. Emerging diseases, 75% of emerging diseases come from animals and then are spread to people. And even if we think of avian influenza, we can't think of a country dealing with that. These viruses are spread by birds flying through their migration pathways. So something in Russia can end up in the southern state because of the migratory pathways. And so that is, I think, the invitation is to look at the oneness, all the interconnections, and we are one earth, regardless of who we are and what country we live in, and race and gender and all of that stuff. We are ultimately, we are all one at the center of it, where we affect everything through our choices. And so one of the ways that I really love the idea of making change, and I see as a huge possibility, is humane education, because we're reaching the children at a stage where they're still curious. There's wonder and curiosity in their eyes, and they are the leaders of the future. So that's what I'm looking to as a very hopeful place for us. And my colleagues are going to speak more about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smrdelj. So moving on, Amanda, bridging from that, can you how can we bring the One Welfare framework into practice?
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks, Magdalena. Hello, everybody. Yeah, that's a really great question, because you heard all of what Magdalena just shared. The One Welfare framework, there's a lot of wisdom in there, and there's a lot of truth and value. And so how do we move the ideas and the understandings and the concepts, that sort of interrelated nature of our planet, and how do we do something with that? How do we connect it to practice in the real world? And so from as Magdalena had been talking about, you can see that One Welfare really encompasses a lot of different things. And so our children eventually are going to be leaders, or they're going to be living in that world, and it'll be important that they understand the complexities of that world. And so when we think about how that theory comes to practice, humane education is something that is really well suited to do that, because the foundations of humane education are rooted in the foundations of One Welfare, this sort of understanding of the interconnected nature of our world.
And for those who are familiar with humane education, can you share a little bit more about what it is and why it's so important to teach our children?
Yes, absolutely, I'd love to. So oftentimes when folks hear humane education, sometimes it can be linked to ideas of, well, that's about how to be kind to animals. You know, children learning how to be kind to their dog or their cat or the robin in the field, or and that's true. That's part of humane education. But as I mentioned, humane education is really about the entirety of our living planet, the living network that makes up our planet. And so, yes, animals are a part of that, but also the environment and also one another. And so humane education truly has this broader scope. And so to speak sort of high level about humane education and what are the components of humane education, there are really sort of three really major components or pillars. So there's this idea, this sort of philosophy or understanding or goal of humane education, which is to teach respect and foster compassion and empathy for the living world. So if we unpack that first component, there's the living world piece. So it's animals, people, and the environment, and they're not isolated spheres. They're massive crossover. It's not just sort of your default Venn diagram. There's really this massive crossover in terms of how related they are, how much they affect each other and impact one another, both for good and for not so good. And then there is the respect for not only those elements independently, but also for how they interrelate and how complex that relationship is. And then there's the empathy component. And really when it comes to empathy, empathy is really about creativity. And so in building these empathy skills in our students and our children, we are teaching them to think creatively and critically about the experience of others. What's important to not just the people in your family, but also the people in your community, in your city, in the world. So really about expanding that sort of circle of compassion. So that's the first component of humane education. So that's really the goal. And then another piece is around skill building, and specifically around building critical thinking skills, because, as we mentioned before, these are clearly complex issues. They are not this sort of what's the word I'm trying to think of? Anyways, like single layered issues. There are lots of different pieces and they shift and move. And, there's sometimes competing priorities. And so another really major part, the second component, is around developing critical thinking skills. So we talked about humane education having that empathy piece, that heart and mind, but we also want it balanced with the critical thinking skills so that children can arrive at new and thoughtful solutions. And so, especially in this world where, there's a lot of complex issues related to social injustice and animal and environmental ethics, we really want them to be able to consider the priorities of and impacts to the different sort of pieces of that sphere, to be able to examine and question their own assumptions and biases, and to be willing and interested to research and learn about things that they don't already know about. Just sort of, again, I'd mentioned expanding that circle of compassion. It's such a critical piece so that children, as their experience of the world and their understanding of the world, there are these things that are important to them. And the more that they reach out through research, through thinking about things that are other than what they already know, that circle of compassion grows. And it's really, really important, especially as they grow into these positions of influence. And so then the third pillar is around this taking meaningful action. So we've got the idea as the first one. The second one is around the skill building. And then the third is around the doing. And so humane education regards children as change makers and leaders, and it really seeks to help them to understand that and see that in themselves. And it supports them in thinking about different decisions they can make about their lives, the ways that they can impact both every day or sort of more formally. And so what we want and what Humane Education wants is for children, as they take on these positions of responsibility and influence, we want them to arrive there with this sense of connection to the living world and awareness of their place in it, and feel empowered and prepared to be able to take actions that consider the priorities of all living things.
Great, thanks, Amanda. This sounds like really important information, important learning for our future leaders. So how can this type of learning take place?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, especially like I mentioned before, you know, I think the world is always sort of a complex place, but now, you know, with connection with the internet, social media, and different ways that we're connected even more so, and how quickly things are moving forward and changing, the type of understanding that takes place in humane education is going to be really critical for the health of our planet and the people and the animals that share that space. So there's lots of different ways that humane education can take place. It can, you know, there's the everyday experiences, you know, let's say a child sees a monarch butterfly in their backyard and notices that it keeps landing on the milkweed. And so maybe they might get curious and think like, oh, I wonder why that is. And they Google it. So they've done the research now. They're sort of expanding their knowledge and understanding of the space around them and the creatures that live there, the people. And then they learn that milkweed's really important for monarchs to survive and live on and reproduce and feed their young. So they decide to take action, and they convince their parents, because those of you who aren't familiar with milkweed, it's a weed, and they somehow convince their parents to plant milkweed in the garden, and that supports the health and population of monarch butterflies. So that's sort of more informal, but really, really important, critical learning that can take place from a humane education lens, pardon me. And then there's also more formal programs that can take place in the community and also in our schools. And there's a lot of really valuable work that's being done at the school and classroom level. And this sort of work is a really amazing opportunity for experts in the field of, you know, experts in organizations that focus on human rights and you know, animal well-being and environmental conservation to you know, put their resources to creating learning resources that teachers can then bring into their classrooms and create them in a way with the classroom in mind, so that it's easy for for teachers and parents, I should say, because parents are also educators. I also want to make sure that I say that, because that's really important. But it's important for educators to be able to take these resources and have it be easy to bring into the classroom, to really support that and have their, you know, go so far as to create partnerships with educators and learn about what's important to them. Because, you know, these organizations, you know, like the Ontario SPCA that are really motivated to make a difference in their particular area, they have these goals that they want people to learn about, and specifically, you know, children in a lot of places. And then you have educators where their goals are they want to teach the children. So isn't that a beautiful partnership to be able to work together and do that? And so, so in 2018, the Ontario SPCA launched such a program called the Animal Smart Humane Education Program. And what that program seeks to do is to teach respect and foster empathy and connection with animals, but also the environment and people. Because while our organization focuses on animal wellness, it's just kind of, you know, accepted that animals do not live in a bubble. They exist, and their well-being exists within the human context and within the environmental context. So to consider that and only focus on that is sort of, you can do more if you look at the whole picture. So the Animal Smart program, when it first started, it started off with a manual. And we were really lucky to be able to partner with some educators to co-create this series of comprehensive lesson plans. And so the goal of the lessons, so the things we wanted the children to learn, came from our sort of humane education centric, so animal, people, and environment, from our mission. And we shared that with the educators. And then what the educators did was take those goals and build these lessons from the lens of an educator. And what that means is that the elements that are, important to educators to be able to bring these lessons into the classroom were integrated into it. And so in that way, these lessons were created by educators for educators. And it makes it breaks down barriers. It makes it easy for teachers to bring these into classrooms. And speaking of barriers, another thing that I get all excited, I'm all out of breath now. I love this program. It's just so impactful. So another thing that we did with that program was it's free and it's online, because the last thing we want is for there to be any kind of financial or geographical barrier to accessing the resource. So it's online and available to anybody that's interested at our Animal Smart webpage. And then once the pandemic hit, so that was 2018 when that was launched. And in that time, since that time, we've been developing the subsequent manuals that are still in development for junior and intermediate. But once the pandemic hit last year, a number of people on our team are also parents. And so we knew what it meant when the schools closed down. And we wanted to be able to support parents and families, and students, and educators who were eventually going to have to be building the virtual programming for their students. So I'm just noticing there's can you hear that? It's sort of back, the echo? Are we good? Oh, good, it's gone now. Thank you for whoever muted, appreciate it. So what we did was we took those lesson plans I was just talking about and we adapted them. We created video adaptations led by our Animal Smart spokes kid, Emerson, and our Animal Smart spokes dog, Buddy. And the Buddy and Emerson acted as sort of like the teacher, but invited the children, even though it was in video form, we invited the children in to answer questions that were part of the lesson, to share their ideas. And we invited, virtually, of course, other students and kids to contribute their thoughts around the things that we were learning, and kept it really fun. We had some with, in one of them, we had a puppet show, and another one we had a story, and we had sort of reenactments of the ideas to keep it fun and engaging for the students. And then the most recent sort of series of videos are around character development. And in Ontario, character development is a really important piece of the educational environment. And it's around building, respect and, responsibility and all these different character traits: honesty, integrity, inclusivity. And so we built these character traits, and these character development videos, were really important for a couple of reasons. One, that the educators were looking for resources to be able to share with the students to have this character education take place. But that sort of learning is a really great fit for humane education as well. I had mentioned earlier that there's the heart piece, right? There's the empathy and the compassion and all, and those pieces. And so what it allowed us to do was to look at these, to create videos that examine these character traits through the lens of humane education. So for example, if we look at respect, what does respect for people look like? What does respect for animals look like? What does respect for the environment look like? And what can you do? And there are these short videos that really support and get kids thinking about that sort of stuff. So now, one thing I want to mention too is, there's all of this work being done at the classroom level, and it's really important. It's also important that there's long-term goals of bringing humane education to the table at the board level as well, so that the school board level, so that resources and opportunities can be put behind bringing humane education learning into classrooms. But that's, you know, what you'll hear from in a few moments is there's just beautiful work being done by teachers and schools and principals, and really impactful work that draws on the learnings and the thinking behind humane education. And so with that, I'll leave it there. I want to leave lots of room for Liz and Alyse to share with us their program, because I've heard this story so many times, and every time I get choked up. So I'll just stop there. And thanks very much for listening to what I have to share about humane education. And yeah, Liz and Alyse, I'll pass it to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amanda. That segues very nicely into speaking with Liz and Alyse now. So Liz, how do we bring the One Welfare framework into practice in your experience?
Thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. It is wonderful to be here. You've heard from the rest of the team the incredible work and thinking that's gone into this. And certainly Alyse can speak in a little bit more detail about a unique and innovative partnership that we started. But when I think about Stephanie's question, as Amanda said, it's so critical that we evolve these theories by connecting them to practice. And the OSPCA, absolutely, you heard, linking to faculties of education was a great starting point. And then moving into partnerships with us as well, so that we could begin to action some of those lessons in the learning and the thinking. Humane education is really well positioned in Ontario, and my hope would be internationally to bring this work and this thinking to classrooms. That understanding that our living world is interrelated and the ideas connect so well to global competencies. And certainly in Ontario, many of the boards are moving to even reporting on these. And those would include a lot of what Amanda talked about: creativity, critical thinking, character, communication, citizenship, and collaboration, as ways of thinking a little bit differently about what's important as we're working with our students to help them not only be global citizens, but be really competitive and thinking deeply about how we want to move forward together as human beings. The other big piece for us that I think this segues really nicely into is the increased awareness around social justice, around data that's surfacing for all of us around the students who are not where they need to be, and thinking about culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, and the idea that we need to expand our understanding of each other and center student voice and partnership in that work, particularly work we're doing in classrooms, and make that work really relevant and meaningful. And I think some of what Amanda has shared gives you a sense of how humane education really helps with that.
So understanding ways to close gaps for underperforming and underserved students is a critical part of the education system. Can you explain these terms in a bit more detail, Liz, and their link to equity outcomes?
Sure, thank you. I mean, really, it's the job of educators to make sure that our students are successful in whatever way they want to be. And for us in Ontario, there are multiple pathways for those students. I think underperforming for us in Ontario is about the outcomes. It's about graduation rates, formal measures, ability to be where we think they should be for their age. That compares a little bit to what we're now calling underserved students, which really makes a much more direct link back to the actions that we're actually doing in classrooms. Underserved really asks us to center the data about the students who are not being successful, and really trying to understand why, and linking that back to our own responsibility and our own action as educators. And I think that's a big difference in the last couple of years in how we've looked at our data, certainly in York Region, and I know across Ontario, as I am able to talk with other educators, and we're all kind of looking at the same data differently. And I think a key learning in our system, again, is around culturally responsive pedagogy. And I think humane education, you heard about building compassion and empathy, really supports thinking differently and surfacing multiple perspectives, which is really critical if we are going to have better solutions. And so, the school data again demonstrates for us that there are ongoing gaps in our achievement, and it's critical that the boards begin to disaggregate this data better, in better ways and more deeply to understand how to build programs of support and intervention so that they have a chance to really keep pathways open for our students. That's, at the end of the day, global citizenship and success and good mental health is what we want for all of them.
In your presentation, Liz, you talk about the invisible middle and a focus on improving mental health and engagement for students. What protective factors were considered in developing this partnership?
So thank you. We had already done a lot of different work with York University, looking at resilience, doing some research and trying to connect with some American teams. Bonnie Bedard and Sarah Trubridge popped to mind. And we had some work, Alyse and I, in other school settings with another organization called Trails Youth Initiatives. And the very first venture into this kind of work was with Scopewood's Leadership Studio. And what they did was really surface for us and confirm the research internationally that whatever we were going to do to support our students, and the invisible middle is what we termed a group that came out in our research. These students tend to be students who are not on your radar, maybe. They may not be attending regularly. They tend not to be surfacing with behavioral issues. They're not the kids that we are looking at suspensions for, but they're not engaged and they're not being successful. And so we really, through all of that learning and the research around protective factors, began to think differently about how we could have partnerships. And ironically, all of those partnerships really connected the environment, being outside with it, and then adding that humane education component, working with you, and that animal domain was just an incredible opportunity, because animals connect all of us as well. And so the three key protective factors that we really thought about, you've heard a little bit about from Amanda already, and that's high expectations for all of our students, opportunities for contribution and participation, which became part of our program with you in terms of service with animals, and then caring relationships, particularly with adults. And that's not going to be a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone here that works with students, but they certainly helped us to build natural connections in this project as well.
How does this collaborative project support the work of improving equitable outcomes for these students?
I'm going to turn it over to Alyse now and let her talk a little bit more about what she's been doing with the project specifically. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Hi, everybody. Great to meet everyone that's here today. Really grateful to be here. And so just to explain a little bit about the program, first is what we've done, as Liz is explaining, is we've partnered with OSPCA and Trails Youth Initiative to develop programs that'll support students that in specific schools in vulnerable communities are underserved. And so with that, we chose multiple different schools, and it was multi-school. So we would have maybe 5 schools in a certain program, go to a certain location and work together so that they're developing relationships, not only in the school that they're in, but also that they will, other students that they'll meet in high school and see around town. So just to bring a bigger community. And then our program was long-term. So something that we also found that was really important is that it's not quantity-based, but quality-based. So a small group of students and a long-term program and a lot of support for those students specifically. So how I found that the program with One Welfare and humane education impacted students and outcomes was because I think we kind of took away like the way that those students were being taught wasn't working for them for various reasons. And then we took that away and we brought more inquiry-based learning. And when Magdalena mentioned silo and teaching, we see silo as a way of teaching. And so often we teach in Canada in a way-centric model of education. And so bringing it back to identities, whereas able to take away from just here, for example, I'm a white settler, so my teaching is going to be the way that I was raised, but it's not my students because my class is extremely diverse. So to make sure that the system that a program is teaching is where the students are at the center, not me. I remove myself, take myself out of it, and see what they want to learn, what they're curious about, and let the land teach them, let
Alyse,
them teach each other, and how I try to move myself from what I see as a teacher to more of a facilitator and asking good questions and not giving them answers of yes, no, right, wrong, and more continuing asking questions. And I found that with that, students gain more confidence. And not only that, they thrive because it's their education. Oh,
all right.
can you not hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. That's perfect. Perhaps.
Hello?
Can you hear us, Alyse?
Alyse. Yes, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Alyse, I'm wondering if you just turned off your camera and just used your microphone.
Is that better?
Yes.
Sounds a lot better.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Alyse, were students able to transfer their learning to other areas of their lives? And if you have any examples to share with us, that would be great.
Yes, they were able to transfer different things that they learned. For example, often the things that they learned that were land-based, they would take home to their family. Things that they learned about compassion and caretaking with animals, they were able to also transfer that with their families and their animals at home. A lot of the students shared too that their leadership and their participation at school greatly improved throughout the program. Some of the students that began with us, as Liz mentioned, the invisible middle, they began in places where often they didn't play with anybody at recess. Often they would not talk in class, they would not really participate. And by the end of the program, most of them felt like they were leaders in the school. They were on different teams at school, they were participating more. And so we saw it in the school community, in the classroom, and they saw it at home.
Amazing. So with experience in alternative education models, where do you see education moving in the future?
So in Canada, we consider the way that we're teaching currently more of a colonial approach to teaching. And so in the future, my hope would be that we start teaching in more decolonize education, and so taking away that the idea that the teacher is the all-powerful and the all-knowing, and opening it up to a community of learners where we are curious about each other, ourselves, and curious about the land and all the other beings that we share the land with.
Wonderful, thank you. And my last question for you, Alyse, the program you developed connects to humane education content in several areas. Can you tell us a bit more about them and how they connect to the goal of improving equitable outcomes for students?
Liz, feel free to add in here as well. But often we found like responsibility and respect became big parts of our program. Students were, sorry if you hear a dog snoring in the back, I've got my dog behind me here. But the students would actually go to the OSPCA and they would care for the animals there. And so they started to feel really responsible for these animals and a deep connection. And so it all began really with relationships and the idea of building those relationships. And we started to learn that the only way to have a relationship is by listening and hearing something. And so with animals, because they don't communicate in our language, the students found that that's by observations and noticing that language isn't just what we say, but also what we do, right? So they started to notice what the animals are asking for, what their needs are, and they started to be able to reflect that by mirroring themselves and seeing their needs as well. So it kind of became responsibility, respect, and learning those through relationships, as well as leadership, and they brought that to the classroom.
The only thing I would add, Alyse, thank you, is that idea that we were working with students who didn't feel connected to a community. And when you think about One Welfare, it really isn't just about all of us individually, it really is about understanding how deeply we're connected. And that wraparound support for these students, and the idea that they could lead and that they could problem solve and that they could develop empathy, not just for the animals, but we saw a shift in their empathy and their ability to see other perspectives in the group and back at school, was just such a powerful example, I think, of what all of this work is really about ultimately.
Absolutely, thank you. This work is so important, and I'd like to thank the 4 panelists here today for joining us. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left, so I'll now pass things over to the moderator to see if we have any questions from our audience.
Hi everyone. So if you have any question, you can ask them in the chat or raise your hand. We don't have much time left, but feel free to ask. So maybe I can go on with a question I would ask the panelists, just to know, in the context of a big urbanization where a lot of education happens in urban contexts, what are the challenges you can encounter and how to overcome them? I don't know if you see what I mean, but I've been thinking about the context where I have been teaching, where it's a lot of cement, a lot of cars, very little nature, maybe districts where there are very little parks. So how do you bring up this kind of human education where you put forward the health and the well-being of nature and animals when there are very little in the environment?
I can start. The first thing that comes to mind naturally, especially since we're right in the middle of the presentation, is and Alyse and Liz, if you want to add any deeper context to this, but part of our relationship with Alyse and Liz and their classes were, the classrooms were, our location, our sort of provincial office is on a bunch of land. And that land provided a place where they actually bused the students to the location to come and use the land and be able to visit and spend time with the animals. So that's one piece. And then the other thing that comes to mind is recently we've been involved with a group out of a sort of higher education school here in Toronto, Rotman. So the group is called I Think, and through that, in Liz's bio, she talks about being a part of integrative thinking, and this group really focuses on this integrative thinking piece. And part of that is us being able to go to connect with classrooms, and they look at our challenges and take a deep look at what we're doing. But then we found ourselves in the middle of a pandemic. And so there are one of the pieces to that is an empathy experience. And an empathy experience is meant to connect the students with the work that we're doing so that they can look at our challenges through a different lens, a more connected lens. But then the pandemic came. So how are we going to do that? And the way that we did that was through these virtual behind the scenes tours. And it was really heartwarming. And in some ways, I was surprised at the level of connection that happened over through the computer. So even if you can't, it's really limited in terms of your ability to get to green spaces or even bus to green spaces. There is connection that can happen through virtual resources. And
if it's okay, I would just like to add to nature's heroic. Like you see giant urban areas come to be, and if you go for a walk, you'll see like a dandelion coming through some broken concrete. Like nature's awesome. And so even in an urban area, like take the students for a walk, see where nature's like winning back, and ask them like the importance of it. Gather around one dandelion in the middle of an urban area, or one tree, and see like the importance of it, feel it, smell it, and see if there's different things that you could eat, and then help them see why we need more.
Thank you so much. I have a few questions from the public. Somebody asked if Animal Smart is available in other languages than English. And the other question, which is a bit longer, I will read it, is: children inherit compassion and kindness towards animals. Do you consider this aspect while designing the school curriculum using a human education perspective? And how do you utilize it?
Thank you to whoever put that question in there, because that was something I missed. Thank you for that. I meant to mention that piece. So we're right at the edge of releasing the primary manual in Spanish and French. So that should be available online for free very soon, within the next couple months. And also we've had folks reaching out from other places looking to connect around translation. So right now, one of our empathy video, the character development video I was talking about, is in the process of being translated into Portuguese, doing a Portuguese voiceover over the video so that students can watch it in that language as well. And then the other question, yes, 100%. When we're building these resources, we definitely have in mind that there's this natural affinity between children and animals. So that is definitely a part of it, but that's not always true. It's not true for all children. Some children may not have had exposure to animals yet. So that's integrated as well into the lesson plans, acknowledging students that may not have pets at home, and how can they be a part of the lesson plans in a way that's meaningful for them too.
Thank you, Amanda. Was there any other short, maybe like 1 minute question? That's great. I encourage you to visit our website, ontariospca.ca, and you can find more information about Animal Smart there as well. So this now concludes our session. Thank you so much to everyone for attending. We'd like to invite you to attend happy hour today from 3:30 to 4:30 Montreal time, where presenters and participants can engage with one another and further the discussion. I'd also like to invite everyone to attend the Friday sessions in which symposium participants will engage in dialogue to determine potential collaborations and projects for the future. So thank you again, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if I could share with Amanda just before she leaves here today.
Yeah, I think that's okay. Yeah.
Great. Hi, Amanda. I'm Shannon Stevens. I live just north of Toronto in Barrie, Ontario.
That's where I am. I'm in
Oh
Barrie.
my goodness.
Yeah.
As I was listening to you, I didn't want to take up everybody else's time, but I wanted to let you know, as a classroom educator, we stumbled onto a program. I was working with a group of kindergarten teachers in my school, and we had a parent who had found out about a chicken program. So long story short, we had this parent bring us a hutch and 3 chickens to our schoolyard. It was the most phenomenal experience. And we had families at the end and children writing letters as to who was going to adopt these chickens and continue on looking after them beyond our 1-month stay. But what evolved in our schoolyard of 450 students and the way they looked at nature and animals, and as your colleague was speaking to, just the relationship that was built with these animals, and coming from the students that don't necessarily find engagement in the academics and aren't on the behavior, they could hardly wait to get outside and just sit and watch chickens and make sure that nobody was going to be tromping down their grass or area where they knew they were starting to eat from. And so it was just another animal program that really, really worked well for us, was so successful. And we as teachers knew nothing about it going into it, but it was one of those things we carried on afterwards. And each year the students really look forward to it in the spring. And when are the chickens coming? When are the chickens coming? I wanted to share that with you. It was really successful, and I appreciate all your work and research you're doing.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that with me. That is so lovely. Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's amazing to see how kids, like, they light up, how they engage at a different level, and how they, like, the changes that happen for them when they're around animals, or they see them, or in this case, like, they're actually able to, were they able to hold them and give them things, or?
Oh, they walked around with them under their arm. They sat and ate lunch with them. They would sit under the picnic table and try and coax them over. And 2 of the 3 chickens would come over and engage with the children after a few days. It was really, really unique. The other program I'm wondering if you're aware of also that we've done is the watching and the hatching of the monarch butterflies, and part of that movement.
Yeah. That's we did that just as our household, but that's an amazing experience to have, to see that, like, to take care of them and watch them and see the changes. Yeah, that's beautiful too. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing with me. That's so I wrote down the chicken program. I'm gonna look into it and see if I can learn more.